Good afternoon to all. My name is Luis Guillermo Solis. I'm the interim director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at Florida International University. I want to give you a very warm welcome to the seminar, to the panel discussion of this afternoon, co-sponsored by LAPOP, Lab, and the Washington Office on Latin America. Today, we're going to be talking about the fading pulse of democracy in Central America, which is a panel discussion based on the results of LAPOP's America's Barometer. We have a panel of experts that will be attending this discussion and will be providing interesting insights as to the results of this research project. Interpretation to Spanish is available through the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen, and therefore you can use either language as you please. So please just note again that interpretation is available. This event again is co-sponsored by the Latin American Public Opinion Project, LAPOP, and the Washington Office for Latin America, and it's conducted from the Center for Latin American and Caribbean at the Florida International University. Allow me to make a presentation of our guests this afternoon. The lead presenter is going to be Dr. Elizabeth Zechmeister, who's a director of the Latin American Public Opinion Project, LAPOP, and a Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Political Science. Professor Zechmeister received her PhD from Duke University in 2003. Her research focuses on comparative political behavior and public opinion, in particular in Latin America. Her work includes studies of voting, ideology, political parties, representation, charisma, and crisis. Professor Zechmeister has received support from the National Science Foundation for research into the public opinion consequences of terrorist threat and nuclear disaster. She has published extensively. She's author of many books, and she has also been awarded the Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching, the Jeffrey Nordhaus Award, and she also received the Vanderbilt Award for Excellence in Graduate Teaching. We are also going to have, as one of our panelists, Dr. Carolina Jiménez Sandoval, who is the president of the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA. She brings to WOLA over 20 years of experience in research and advocacy for human rights in the Americas and throughout the world. She has a PhD in international studies from Waseda University in Japan and did a postdoc program in human rights and ethics at the Central University of Venezuela. She holds a master's degree in international law and Asian studies from Chuo University in Japan and a master's of philosophy and international relations from the University of Cambridge in England. She graduated from the Universidad Central de Venezuela with a BA in international relations as well, and she has extensive on-the-ground experience on human rights issues throughout Latin America. And finally, last but not least, my colleague, Dr. Jose Miguel Cruz, who is the Director of Research at the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at the Florida International University in Miami. Previously, he was visiting professor of the Department of Political and International Relations at FIU. He holds a PhD in political science from Vanderbilt University, a master's degree in public policy in Latin America from Oxford University, and a bachelor's degree in psychology from the Central American University of El Salvador. Dr. Cruz was also the director of the Public Opinion University Institute at the UCA from 1993 to 2006 and has served as a consultant for many regional institutions and international cooperation agencies. Dr. Cruz is a researcher on issues of security, violence, youth gangs, political culture, and democratization, and has published more than 100 article chapters and academic reports in English and Spanish. So without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Elizabeth Zechmeister, who is the director of LAPOP and who is in charge of this great instrument of political analysis. Dr. Zechmeister, The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, President Solis. It's great to be here today. Thank you all for coming. I'm sharing a presentation with you, so give me 1 minute to pull this up. Can someone on the panel give me a thumbs up if the presentation is showing? Excellent. It's my pleasure to be here today to present a set of findings from the recently released 2021 America's Barometer survey. A core goal of the America's Barometer is to take the pulse of democracy in the Western Hemisphere. And you can see that goal reflected in the image here from the cover of our most recent regional report. Today, we're focusing in on the Central American region, and specifically, I'm going to focus in on 5 countries. The data from these countries provide us an opportunity to look at variation in public opinion, both across countries and over time. And what you'll see is a lot of variation. What does that variation mean with respect to the pulse of democracy in Central America? In this presentation, you'll see some signs of democratic resilience in the region, and also some reasons for concern. There's a question mark in the title of today's event. I think this mark reflects the questions we might have over dueling tendencies within contemporary public opinion in the region, as well as questions we might have over where the region and the individual countries within it are headed next. My goal here is to provoke your thoughts on these questions about the pulse of democracy in Central America by presenting a set of top-line findings from the America's Barometer project. The data that I'll present today come from LAPOP's America's Barometer. The America's Barometer is a comparative survey of the Western Hemisphere. Every 2 years, we work with partners across the region to collect standardized, nationally representative samples of public opinion on a variety of topics related to democratic governance. Until 2019, the surveys in the Latin American and Caribbean region were conducted face-to-face. When the pandemic began, we overhauled our protocols and we began conducting surveys by phone. In all cases, we deploy layers of rigorous quality control to the data collection, processing, and analyses. You can find more information about the project, including the raw data sets, as well as many other resources at our website. The star of the show today is the 2021 America's Barometer, given that these data provide the most current comparative profile of public opinion in the region. While the project itself is broader in scope, the countries that I'll cover in this presentation are the 5 that you see here. And for each case, you can see the dates for this year's data collection, beginning in March in Costa Rica and ending in August in Nicaragua. And here are the key takeaways from a top-line look at public opinion in these countries. In the slides that follow, I will show you variation across countries in support for democracy. High and stable in Costa Rica, low in Guatemala and Honduras, and on the rise in Nicaragua and El Salvador. I'll also show you that we find a strong preference for having voice in politics. People want to be able to express themselves and to have their needs and preferences reflected in politics. Political scientists and democracy advocates view elections as a key mechanism by which the public can translate their voice into politics. Many in the public, though, perceive electoral democracy to be compromised with respect to elections, politicians, and public officials. Concern about the capacity of the broader political system to effectively represent the people appears in a number of countries to feed into greater tolerance for a strong executive who will work around Congress and others to get the job done. So that's a set of top-line takeaways. Let me now show you the data on which they are based. First, we'll look at support for democracy and satisfaction with democracy. Since 2004, the project has asked people to indicate their support for democracy in the abstract. The question wording here and in all cases in this presentation can be found at the bottom of the slide. This question asks, to what extent people agree or disagree with this notion that democracy may have its problems, but it is better than any other form of government. The lines show you the percentage of adults in each country that expresses a positive disposition toward democracy over time. The yellow line is Costa Rica, fairly steady and elevated at the top. The green line along the bottom is Honduras, unsteady and comparatively low. In between, we see that between the last round of the survey and 2021, there has been an increase in support for democracy within the publics in El Salvador and Nicaragua. Here we see those values for 2021 by country. In Costa Rica and El Salvador, almost 3 in 4 adults expresses support for democracy in the abstract, while in Honduras and Guatemala, only 1 in 2. Turning next to satisfaction with how democracy is working in the country, we see mostly lower values and a bit more instability over time. Importantly, when we look across time, we see that there is a downward trend in satisfaction with democracy, how democracy is working in the country. A downward trend in many countries starting in 2014. It's a trend that leveled off in Costa Rica in 2021, and a trend that rebounded in an extraordinary way in El Salvador in 2021. Here we see the data for 2021, and El Salvador clearly stands out as exceptional, with 78% of the public expressing satisfaction with how democracy is currently working in the country. And conversely, only 30% of Hondurans feeling the same, a data point that puts in context the recent defeat of the incumbent party's presidential candidate in that country. Now, the concept of democracy as an abstract political system is abstract. And so we asked in the survey a number of questions to try to understand what it is that people really want to see in their political systems. And a key answer to that question that we find in the data is that they want to be heard. One lens through which we can see that preference is here in responses to a question that asks people to consider a trade-off between a system that guarantees a minimum standard of living without freedom of expression, or the reverse, freedom of expression, but no guaranteed access to basic income and services. In every country, the vast majority are willing to trade off economic guarantees in favor of freedom of expression. And this is something that we find not only in Central America, but also across the LAC region as a whole. In the survey in 2021, we also asked a number of other questions about people's preferences over types of political systems. We asked, for example, people's preferences over direct democracy. And again, when we look at the region as a whole, we find high support for systems in which the voice of the people matters. Yet, as I mentioned at the top, many within the public harbor serious doubts about the capacity of elections to faithfully channel their voice. So this slide here shows results from a similar trade-off question as the one we saw before. But this time, we ask people to make a choice between a system that guarantees access to basic income and services or a system that has elections. Whereas the majority would not trade off freedom of expression, they are willing to trade off elections. In other words, the publics in these countries put comparatively less value on elections. An exception here is Nicaragua, where only 45% of the public would give up elections. In contrast, in Costa Rica, 64% would be willing to give up elections for that minimum standard of living. And this is also, on average, a tendency that we see across the entire LAC region. So Central America is not exceptional here. There's a tendency on average for people to put less value comparatively on elections than on freedom of expression. Now, if you look at these values here on the slide and you compare Nicaragua to Costa Rica, you might think that people in Nicaragua have more confidence in electoral processes in their country than Costa Rica. But we don't actually see evidence of that. In both these countries, we included a few additional questions about elections. And so I'll show you those here. Here you can see the percent of people who believe that the rich sometimes or always buy elections. And you can see that 84% of Hondurans think that elections are compromised in this way, more than in Costa Rica. Yet, what I would encourage you to take away from this slide is that in both countries, an overwhelming majority of people feel that electoral processes in the country are somehow rigged in favor of the wealthy. We also asked about the secrecy of the ballot, and the results are similar. 81% of Hondurans think that politicians can sometimes or always know who a person voted for. Fewer report that in Costa Rica, but yet still the number there is close to 70%. We also asked a straightforward question about how much trust people have in elections in the country. This is a question that we've asked over time. So you can see here different patterns across the different countries over time. For most of the series, Costa Rica claims the top spot in terms of trust in elections, while in 2021, trust in elections surged upward in El Salvador. Meanwhile, trust in elections is particularly low in Guatemala and Honduras. Now here we see the values on this question just for 2021. In Honduras, only about 1 in 2 adults expresses trust in elections. In Costa Rica, just over 1 in 2 adults trust elections. And then we see this newly reached high value in El Salvador. In addition to concerns about the integrity of elections, we also find concerns about the integrity of elected officials and public officials more generally. Here we see that in every country, more than 50% of the public believes that more than half or all politicians are corrupt. This negative view of corruption in politics has increased over time in Costa Rica, and even more so in Nicaragua. In 2021, there's an interesting convergence in the data, with Costa Rica and El Salvador at 58%, and the others at 68% of the population perceiving widespread political corruption. The survey also asks not only about perceptions of corruption, but experiences with corruption. In 2021, we asked about experiences with corruption in dealings with government employees. And we've asked this question over time so we can look across time as well as at values in this current year. So here are the data on experiences with corruption victimization by public officials. You can see a lot of interesting variation over time. And what I want to highlight is the increase in all countries in 2021 compared to the last round. So corruption victimization experiences have increased in recent times. In particular, in Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Honduras, we see a very large increase in the percentage of people who say that they were asked to pay a bribe by a public official in the last year. That upward tendency is something that we find across the LAC region as a whole, and seems potentially related to shifting interactions and incentives under the pandemic. Here you see the values for 2021. with experiences with bribe victimization by public officials greatest in Nicaragua and lowest in El Salvador and Costa Rica. Now, finally, what does this mixed set of results lead to in terms of how people would like to see their government run? On the one hand, as I noted, people want voice, but they have doubts about the extent to which elections and elected officials faithfully represent them. That type of public opinion profile lends itself to support for populist leaders who centralize power in the executive office and operate around traditional checks and balances in the name of representing the people and giving them that voice. We've asked a number of questions over the years that are designed to tap into these types of attitudes. And I'm going to show you one of these. This is a question that asks whether or not in times of sort of very difficult times, it is justifiable for the president to close Congress and govern without its input. On average, across the Central American region and across the LAC region as a whole, we see increased levels of tolerance for this type of maneuver, which we often refer to as an executive coup, as you see in the title here, meaning that the president is seizing power from another branch of government. We didn't ask this question this round in Costa Rica, so I don't have those data, but we did include it in these 4 other countries. And what you can see is an overtime increase in all cases, with a specific increase in 2021 in 3 of them, most notably, most sharply in El Salvador. In fact, we pull that trend line out here on this slide to put a spotlight on it because it's an extraordinary change in comparison to earlier years. In earlier years, earlier rounds of the survey, fewer than 1 in 5 Salvadorans agreed that this type of maneuver, the shuttering of Congress, could be justified in difficult times. In 2021, that value jumped to 1 in 2. And that is where I'm going to stop, hopefully having given you a lot of food for thought. And as I conclude, I just want to take a minute to recognize the team that makes up the LAPOP lab. Among other things, this team is responsible for the innovation, the strict quality control standards, and the processing and distribution of the data and findings that I'm presenting today and that you can find on our website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zechmeister. We are grateful for your presentation, extremely interesting information from the LAPOP Lab Director's analysis. Ahora vamos a darle la palabra a la doctora Carolina Jiménez Sandoval, quien es la presidenta de WOLA, el Washington Office on Latin America. Ella va a hacer su presentación en español. Pueden ustedes acceder a esa presentación en español usando el botón de interpretación en su barra inferior. You can use your interpretation button to accede to this presentation by Dr. Carolina Jiménez. Doctora Jiménez Sandoval, tiene usted la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias y buena tarde. Un saludo a todas las personas que nos acompañan. Un especial agradecimiento, por supuesto, al Kimberly Green Center for Latin America and the Caribbean y al LAPOP Lab para el Washington Office on Latin America. Para mí en especial es un gusto estar acompañada de panelistas tan prestigiosos, ¿no? Que hacen un trabajo súper indispensable para la reflexión necesaria, ¿no? Sobre temas de democracia y de Estado de Derechos en toda la región y en este momento especialmente en América Latina. Por supuesto, un gran saludo al presidente Solís y también nuestro agradecimiento por moderar el evento de hoy. Esta reflexión la tenemos en un momento importante en el que en un año hemos tenido 3 elecciones presidenciales, hablo de Centroamérica, que ciertamente han determinado o están por determinar el futuro de ciertos países, ¿no? Las elecciones parlamentarias de El Salvador, que obviamente abrieron, ¿no? Un espacio para que el Poder Ejecutivo, ¿no?, pudiera avanzar una agenda muy poco democrática en el país. Las elecciones nicaragüenses de hace apenas unas semanas, que básicamente consolidaron un proyecto autoritario ya muy andado, y las elecciones en Honduras, que tal vez han sorprendido a muchos analistas y que podrían significar, a diferencia de los otros países, una reivindicación de las elecciones como instrumento de cambio, aunque obviamente eso está por verse, ¿no? Entonces, frente a los resultados, ¿no?, que nos han presentado de la encuesta, yo quiero abordarlos a través de dos miradas o a través de dos aproximaciones. La primera mirada o aproximación es lo que denomino la mirada de la preocupación reiterada, de la preocupación prolongada. O sea, cómo seguimos viendo patrones que incluso se incrementan, que ya habíamos visto antes en otros resultados, en otras encuestas, en otras discusiones, y que nuevamente vemos, y por eso hablo de preocupaciones reiteradas, ¿no? Y la otra mirada con la que también creo que es importante abordar y reflexionar sobre estos temas es la mirada del optimismo cauto, del optimismo prudente, porque siento que también estos resultados nos invitan a ver que no todo está perdido, ¿no? Que hay actitudes, ¿no?, importantes dentro de la ciudadanía de estos países que son, ¿no?, una luz al final del túnel. Entonces, comienzo por la primera aproximación, ¿no?, la de las preocupaciones que persisten, ¿no? Creo que, y sin duda estoy segura de que cualquier persona que vea a América Latina en general, pero que ve estos resultados sobre Centroamérica, se alarma, ¿no?, con el incremento de la tolerancia que existe dentro de las ciudadanías hacia, ya le llamemos executive coup, o hacia la concentración de poder en manos del Ejecutivo, ¿no? Y creo que esto es parte de una preocupación prolongada, porque esto se traduce, y creo que es la pregunta que hay que hacer, ¿en qué se traduce que un país, una sociedad tolere, ¿no?, executive coups? ¿En qué se traduce que un país, una sociedad tolere mayor concentración de poder ejecutivo? Bueno, se traduce en la aceptación del quiebre del equilibrio de poderes, ¿no? Si una sociedad está dispuesta, o incluyo aceptar, ¿no?, la preeminencia y el power grab del poder ejecutivo, es una sociedad que no tiene, ¿no?, como valor político el equilibrio de poderes, que al fin y al cabo es un pilar fundamental de toda democracia, ¿no? Entonces, esto obviamente que no es nuevo, sí es una causa de alarma, y aunque no quiero entrar en todas las diferencias de país a país, creo que es innegable que este 2021 pone a El Salvador, ¿no?, como centro de esa tolerancia, ¿no? Y bueno, las elecciones en mayo creo que propiciaron ese power grab por parte del presidente Bukele, con, ¿no?, una aceptación, no generalizada, pero sí importante, ¿no?, de sus seguidores y quienes apoyan su gobierno a ese quiebre, ¿no?, del equilibrio de poderes. Entonces, creo que ese tipo de actitudes son siempre el terreno fértil para el surgimiento o la consolidación de liderazgos autoritarios, ¿no?, cuando la propia sociedad acepta el quiebre del equilibrio de poderes. Una segunda causa de preocupación, ¿no?, en este grupo de resultados es la pérdida de confianza en las elecciones, ¿no?, o en la democracia en su sentido electoral. Y es preocupante porque las elecciones siempre han sido consideradas en toda democracia representativa como no solo uno de los pilares de la democracia, sino como el vehículo, ¿no?, para la continuación de la democracia. Es decir, las elecciones son el instrumento que tiene toda sociedad para garantizar alternabilidad, ¿no?, de poder, y para garantizar la expresión y el ejercicio de un derecho político como es el voto. cuando las sociedades nuevamente, pierden, ¿no?, total confianza en el sistema electoral o en la idea de la democracia y de la continuidad de la democracia a través del voto, obviamente también estamos ante un peligro grande. Creo que sería interesantísimo, y aquí hago un paréntesis, ver cómo se sienten las y los hondureños con esta pregunta en este momento, ¿no? Porque es una pregunta hecha con anterioridad. Yo me atrevería a decir que probablemente obtendríamos resultados distintos si volvemos a hacer esta pregunta en Honduras. No lo sabemos, ¿no? Pero eso también nos da también un poco tal vez de optimismo cauto, ¿no? De que estas tendencias que vemos aquí también, ¿no?, cambian cuando el propio ejercicio de la democracia, aún en contextos muy conflictivos y muy difíciles, te muestran que hay vehículos o instrumentos de la propia democracia que son rescatables, ¿no?, como es el caso del voto. Pero no deja de ser una gran preocupación, ¿no?, que se haya perdido, y también pasa en Sudamérica, como bien lo decían, la confianza en el sistema electoral y la confianza en la elección, ¿no?, como un principio de la democracia. Y yo cerraría esta parte de preocupaciones extendidas y que persisten en la región con el tema de la corrupción. Es un sentimiento generalizado en toda América Latina que la corrupción es la, ¿no?, la gran pandemia que no se va y que parece que muta además, ¿no? Y las variantes, sí, para seguir hablando en términos epidemiológicos que hoy en día no son tremendamente naturales a todos, la ha mostrado justamente el periodismo de investigación, ¿no? Cuando en la región, ¿no?, que por suerte todavía hay un periodismo independiente en toda América Latina, pero hay que reconocer el periodismo independiente de América Central, que ha puesto de manifiesto cómo se expresa, ¿no?, las distintas formas de corrupción del poder, ¿no? Y entonces cuando todavía no habíamos tal vez comprendido en toda su totalidad lo que nos decían los Panama Papers, aparecen los Pandora Papers, ¿no?, que como sabemos ha involucrado directamente tanto a presidentes en ejercicio como a expresidentes de América Latina en casos, ¿no?, que deberían estar siendo investigados porque constituyen actos de corrupción. La corrupción ha venido carcomiendo, ¿no?, la confianza que tienen los electorados y los ciudadanos en sus sistemas de gobierno, y ese dato de que básicamente casi todos los países muestran, ¿no?, que es la opinión de las y los ciudadanos que todos los líderes son corruptos, bueno, tiene obviamente un gran impacto en cómo la ciudadanía percibe no solo los liderazgos individuales, sino también a los partidos políticos mismos. Entonces, creo que la corrupción y cómo se siente la ciudadanía sobre la corrupción es también terreno fértil, ¿no?, para que se apoyen los liderazgos, en este caso populistas, cuya promesa principal y cuya maquinaria de propaganda se concentra en que dicho líder será el salvador que ponga fin a la corrupción, porque es una, ¿no?, creencia generalizada en todos los países, y lo ven, ¿no?, como una de las causas por las cuales ni la democracia ni la economía misma del país se desarrolla. Entonces creo que la corrupción continúa siendo uno de esos agravantes, ¿no?, para que muchos ciudadanos se vayan separando de algunos de los principios fundamentales que sostienen una democracia. Y ya para concluir, porque creo que José Miguel tiene cosas muy interesantes que decir, tengo acá mi reloj marcando que ya debo comenzar a concluir, quiero hablar del optimismo cauto. Digo cautos porque creo que cuando uno analiza política, sobre todo desde una perspectiva de democracia y de análisis de derechos, hay que ser prudente, ¿no?, porque la región cambia a una velocidad que a veces es desde el análisis o desde la práctica propia de quienes trabajamos en temas de derechos humanos, de análisis políticos, no logramos, ¿no?, tener la misma velocidad de análisis para entender los cambios. Hay que rescatar, ¿no?, ese resultado tan importante de la exigencia de las y los ciudadanos, o de la preeminencia que dan las y los ciudadanos a su participación o a su voz, ¿no? que en Centroamérica, la mayoría de las y los centroamericanos estén diciendo que la necesidad de expresarse sin censura, ¿no? La necesidad de tener una voz que pueda hacer exigencias, canalizar demandas, es más importante incluso, ¿no?, que la idea de un salario básico extendido, etcétera, es una razón para que sintamos que todavía pueden o fortalecerse sistemas democráticos que se están debilitando o empezar, ¿no?, un cambio en aquellos que en este momento pues sí están viviendo situaciones ya de un autoritarismo más consolidado. Que las y los centroamericanos expresen además con mucha generalidad la importancia que para ellos reviste el poder tener una voz en sus asuntos públicos es algo que no puede subestimarse, porque justamente así, y esto nos lo dice la historia, es que comienzan los cambios políticos y los cambios sociales, no solo en América Latina, sino a nivel global. Cuando las y los ciudadanos no logran, ¿no?, canalizar sus voces y sus demandas porque se lo impiden, si este es un principio muy fuerte, muy fundamental para la ciudadanía, comienza entonces la ciudadanía no solo a cuestionar el poder que le impide expresarse y que le impide demandar o exigir los cambios que requieren, sino que entonces busca diferentes maneras para expresarse y canalizar su voz. Entonces, me siento cautamente optimista, ¿no?, al saber que a pesar de estos grandes findings o hallazgos de la encuesta, en donde obviamente nos cuestionamos mucho, ¿no?, de cómo las propias personas de Centroamérica favorecen, ¿no?, prácticas no democráticas, hay allí también un gran mensaje que se envía con esa defensa tan fuerte, no solo de la libertad de expresión, sino también de su necesidad de poder, ¿no?, tener espacio para que su voz como ciudadanía sea escuchada, y creo que allí hay mucho trabajo que hacer para poder elevarlas y poder transformar o traducir ese hallazgo específico en una lucha por la democracia más regional. Termino acá para darle el paso a José Miguel. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a usted, doctora Jiménez Sandoval, por la presentación que nos acaba de hacer. La doctora Jiménez Sandoval es la presidenta de WOLA, el Washington Office on Latin America. Quiero recordarles que pueden hacer sus preguntas para obtener respuestas del panel por medio del botón de Q&A que está en la barra inferior de su pantalla. Dentro de unos minutos iniciaremos el traslado de las preguntas a nuestro invitado. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Jose Miguel Cruz. Dr. Cruz is the Research Director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at FIU. Jose Miguel, tienes la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Presidente. Thank you so much, President Solis. And I want to start by thanking Liz Zechmeister and the LAPOP Lab team for the opportunity to comment on these results. Also, obviously, to Carolina Jiménez, the president of WOLA, and WOLA for co-sponsoring this event today, and to give us all this opportunity to think about what Central Americans are saying about the political systems, the democracy, wherever the state of their democracy is right now. So thank you all, and thank you for joining us. I'll try to advance personal interpretation of the results that Liz has just shared with us. What do these results mean in political terms, or how did we get here in terms of the support for democracy and the satisfaction for democracy for Central Americans? And let me start with something very basic and thinking why these data are important, especially in this context right now. Well, many years ago, Martin Lipset said that in order to survive, a political system needed effectiveness and legitimacy, right? And effectiveness refers to the actual performance of the political system, right? I mean, the capacity of the system, of the political system to deliver to the people, right? Especially a democracy. And legitimacy obviously means this capacity to maintain the belief among the people that the existing political institutions are the most appropriate for the society, right? People have to be convinced that the political institutions they have are the best for them, right? And so legitimacy and this trust that these institutions will work for them are really, really important. So I think these data help us to understand where we are right now in Central America based on how people, or what the expectations of the people have been in the last 20, 30 years, right? And I think what we're seeing right now in Central America is in some way is the result of the exhaustion of the people toward the political systems, right? Is this kind of tiredness of the end of that momentum that was created with the political transitions that happened in the 1990s, almost 20, 30 years ago. And I think it's important to remember that when these political transitions occurred in the 1990s, they created a lot of expectations among Central Americans, right? In El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, were ending civil wars, long civil wars and bloody civil wars. Honduras removed the military from institutions of power at that moment. And that signal, I think, that signal an important moment. People hope that the new political order, the new political system will be able to deliver. Now, what happened? I think it is important to sort of analyze what happened with institutions in the Central American countries. And I think it's possible to divide the institutions resulting from the political transitions in three groups, right? Those institutions that work fairly well, right? Those institutions that, were weaker, weren't that strong, but delivered to some extent. And those institutions that definitely were not capable enough to delivering. And in the first group, those institutions that were fairly strong were all those institutions related to elections, to electoral process. After all, the political transitions sort of made sure that we will have regular and fair elections from time to time, right? So they may have some problems, right? But to some extent, what these institutions generated was this a sort of reliable rotation of power, a reliable rotation of power in between different groups, right? And we can see that mostly, almost all Central America. Nicaragua, Honduras in the 90s, El Salvador, obviously, Guatemala too, right? They may have some problems, but in general terms, elections worked well, right? Then we have these other kind of institutions that weren't that, they didn't work that well. They show some signs of working to some extent, but weren't that good. And those basically refer to the accountability institutions, control and accountability institutions. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, right? And when they didn't, we have examples like the CC getting in Guatemala, trying to, you know, basically compensate, right, and overcome those things. And then we have those institutions more related to the government affairs, the day-to-day government affairs, that were supposed to, that were most in terms of welfare, in terms of delivering things for the people, right? Education, health, social programs. And they basically were very weak. They didn't work well, right? In part because the socioeconomic reforms that were needed, you know, at the time of the transition were never really implemented, and quite the contrary, right? Some of the reforms the economic reforms that were pursued in the 90s and the 2000s were they were going on in the other way, right? They were basically shrinking the government and basically eliminating many social programs that for the people were important. What happened in this context is that if you have weak accountability and almost non-existent institutions to respond to people, well, they in a rotating electoral system, or let's say, or electoral rotating groups that come to power, basically you have the conditions to generate systemic networks of patronage and clientelism, right? Basically the way for each group in power to rule was to create its own networks of patronage and clientelism that just, you know, benefited some people, but not everybody, as everybody was expecting, right, at that moment. And here comes something important. I like always to quote my mentor many years ago, Ignacio Martín Baró, one of the Jesuits murdered in 1989. He used to say that Central Americans live under a permanent state of vital emergency, right? Meaning the regular Central America is always struggling to survive, right? It's trying to make ends meet. And any change of the situation, any disruption of the equilibrium, of the social equilibrium, meant can lead to death in some cases, right? So in countries, you know, affected by high levels of poverty and inequality, like the Northern Central America, so any disruption basically was interpreted like, you know, like a risk, right? And Central America has had many catastrophes, disasters that even increase those levels of vulnerability, so risk, right, among the people, right? Hurricane Mitch in 1998, the earthquakes in El Salvador in 2000, the constant droughts in Guatemala, those basically added to this sensation to the people that the political systems weren't able to deliver, right? People kept viewing leaders rotating because the electoral system worked fairly well, right? So it didn't matter whether you were in the left, on the right, you were of this party or that other party, but those parties really didn't deliver in the way that people expect, right? So we start seeing those signs of fatigue in the people, not even now. This is not happening now. We started seeing this in the 2000s. I remember very well when I was in Vanderbilt collaborating with LAPOP, for instance, and we did the 2008 survey, and Mitch Seligson and Orlando Perez also basically sounded the alarm of the results in Honduras, right? This is 2008, and in 2008, the LAPOP survey already showed that people were very dissatisfied with democracy, or they didn't support democracy at that moment. Then you have the coup in Honduras in 2009, right? And I'm not suggesting that the people asked for the coup, but in a context in which people were very, very disenchanted with democracy, right? Spaces were created for, the military or different groups to go ahead and basically perform the coup d'etat. So basically what it means is that in this situation, any political leader that is able to sort of say and show that he or she will deliver something, basically, sometimes interpreted as, oh, well, democracy might be working, right? And that's what we saw, for instance, if you look at the data on Nicaragua in the mid 2010s, right? During that period, for instance, support for democracy and to some extent satisfaction for democracy in Nicaragua increased when Ortega was in power. But it was the period of, to some extent, what we can call the vacas gordas, right? The fat cows, in which Ortega, with the Venezuelan money, was delivering all these social programs, right? And people at that moment basically rated, democracy better than other countries, right? Even though at that moment Ortega was already attacking the democratic institutions, right? But he was benefiting from that, from those programs, which is exactly what I think Bukele is doing right now, has been doing in El Salvador since he got to power, right? Bukele builds his popularity based on this connection with the people, right? And Honduras during this period actually gets the lowest scores of democracy because obviously after the coup, no government in Honduras was able to deliver anything, substantial to the people, right? So what we have now is this situation which, as Carolina said, some governments have gone into, increasing authoritarianism, although some people will see that as signs of democracy. However, I would say this growing authoritarianism is already starting to produce some effects and raising concerns among the people, right? And I think Nicaragua is a good example, right? In Nicaragua, if I remember very well, usually in Nicaragua, people tend to value more basic income and services over other things. Now, in the last survey, the one just presented by Liz, what we're seeing is the other way around. It's people start seeing, freedom of expression is more important than basic income. Having good elections having elections is more important than basic income, because at this point many Nicaraguans have realized, the importance of having, alternability, having, the possibility to remove a government that is not working well, right? And hence the effort of the Nicaraguan government right now to basically close any spaces, and that those institutions that in the 90s and the early 2000s worked well electorally in Nicaragua are no longer there, right? And my concern is that may happen also in a place like in El Salvador. However, as and I'll be ending soon, and as Carolina said, there is some hope in the Honduran election. I don't want to maximize or want to basically over value what happened in Honduras. But in Honduras, if we think that Honduras was the first country in which dissatisfaction with democracy went down and has remained down for many years right now, but at least the possibility to having some electoral institutions that keep open the possibility of alternability, of removing bad governments, right? And people taking that opportunity, I think we have there a light of hope, right? I think the challenge is to keep at least those institutions at this point functioning, right? But then take the next step, right? Which is strengthening those institutions of accountability, right? And obviously strengthening institutions of deliverance, right? Deliverance for the people. Now, that will take more time. But this is, I think, this is really, it might be a sign of hope at this moment. So I will end here. I've gone over the time, and I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jose Miguel. Muchas gracias, Jose Miguel. And now we're going to go to the questions and the answers from our panel. Allow me to begin using the privilege of being the moderator to remind everybody that this webinar is called The Fading Pulse of Democracy in Central America, but the flyer has a beautiful photograph taken during the student movement in Guatemala at the beginning of President Yamatei's term that says, "Me niego a vivir en una dictadura." I don't know if you can see it here. It's a beautiful flyer. It's a beautiful photograph. Me niego a vivir en una dictadura. Yet, the numbers that we've seen in some of the countries indicate otherwise, that people are maybe not willing to live in a dictatorship as such, but they're willing to compromise. They're willing to do a certain tit for tat as long as some of their basic conditions are met, and that there is a trade-off of economic guarantees for freedom, and that a democracy with no results or scant results is a vulnerable democracy. I would like our panel to deliberate a bit on this, particularly because there's a question by Moises Martinez Mayorga talking about he's a journalist in Nicaragua, focusing on the paradox of a country where there's a lot of well, there's been ample proof of a dictatorial government taking power, and yet there is willingness to admit that in exchange for economic and social conditions. So anyone who may want to speak a bit more about this, although the three of you have already voiced this concern. Maybe we can begin with you.
Oh, thank you for the comment. And I think that I was pausing because I thought, first of all, Carolina and Miguel, thank you so much for your comments. I was pausing because I think Miguel's comments touch on this question already in a really important way. So the trend that we see, or the outcome that we see in terms of public opinion in Nicaragua, is that there is, like in many other countries in the region, a willingness to trade off material gain for freedom of expression, so a prioritization of freedom of expression, and a similarly comparatively higher value put on elections than in other countries. So when a trade-off question is posed, just to remind those who are here of what we found. I think that Miguel's comments, I almost feel like I'm going to just paraphrase Miguel, so then maybe I could just turn it over to Miguel to correct my paraphrase. But I really felt like they captured the gist of this very well, which is that in a country in which people really do want to have their voice represented and heard in politics, but yet see that that the election apparatus, that the institutions and processes around elections have not led to the outcomes that they would hope for, that there's sort of a greater emphasis put on elections as a means to bring about that, perhaps outcome in the future. Miguel, is that sort of a fair kind of summary of what you were saying, or do you want to maybe jump in and offer a little bit more context there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I think it's fair, at least. And yes, I mean, I've been following Nicaragua for some time. And one of the big things that always, struck me, especially some years ago, when already Ortega was, as I said, eroding the institutions in Nicaragua, right? In that moment, given the choice, people will go for, for the economy, for economic gain over things like freedom, things like that, as far as I remember, right? And this was, this was a period in which Nicaragua was doing very well economically. Nicaragua was, I think, one of the countries that was growing more significantly in the region, right? Despite being, having economic problems, but it was doing very well. Everybody seemed to be behind the government, the business people, well, some people in the media, not all, everybody, not all, obviously. And even the United States have, some kind of, decent relationship with Nicaragua, although Nicaragua was already, as I said, eroding the situation, right? But everybody seemed like happy to ignore those things, just to think about the economic situation. Now the situation is completely different, because now we have a government that is blatantly closing all political spaces, right? And people are, in my opinion, are realizing, hang on, we don't want this. We want, we want spaces to be able to change the government, to express our opinions, to have freedoms, right? And at this point, that's more important than economic, the economic progress, right? So I think that makes certainly a good point on how things have evolved in Nicaragua, and how they might evolve also, I think, in El Salvador, unfortunately.
Gracias, José Miguel. Voy a pedirle a Carolina que se refiera a eso, pero en el contexto de una pregunta que nos hace Mauricio Silva, y tiene que ver con la referencia específica a que no se mencionan pobreza, a la pobreza y las difíciles condiciones sociales, incluso violación de los derechos humanos, y que falta conciencia y educación política de las mayorías que no parecieran estar particularmente valorando los procesos democráticos. Este tema de la pobreza efectivamente no es un tema menor, porque no es cualquier pobreza, es una pobreza profunda, estructural, perdurable. ¿Cómo podría usted ubicar esto en ese contexto?
Gracias. A mí me parece muy importante la reflexión, la pregunta que hace Mauricio, porque yo creo que cuando analizamos sobre todo o la erosión de la democracia o la llegada de líderes autoritarios, tendemos a ver a quien llega al poder, y tipo Bukele u otros, tendemos a ver a ese líder autoritario como la causa del deterioro democrático, sin darnos cuenta que realmente todos son más consecuencia que causa, ¿no? Ese populismo y esas promesas falsas mesiánicas, ¿no?, que hacen, y ese rompimiento o quiebre que prometen hacer con el pasado, tiene aceptación en poblaciones agotadas, ¿no? Como lo decía José Miguel, en poblaciones que didn't see the democracy delivered. Entonces, la llegada al poder de estos líderes, y bueno, efectivamente el ataque constante, ¿no?, y la erosión que generan el sistema democrático son más una consecuencia que una causa. Entonces la pregunta es, ¿cuál es la causa, no? Lo que decía José Miguel, bueno, si democracy doesn't deliver, que es justamente what should have democracy deliver, es la pregunta. Y la democracia tiene, sobre todo para países en donde la pobreza, y no solo la pobreza y la desigualdad, porque no todos son pobres en Centroamérica, ¿verdad? Lo que genera eso en las poblaciones, y no en vano, ¿no? De estos países proviene un número importante de personas en contexto de movilidad humana, ¿no? En contexto de migración forzada. O sea, ¿por qué salen los nicaragüenses, los hondureños, los guatemaltecos, etcétera, de sus países? Es porque sus países no han logrado, ¿no? Ya esto es un problema anterior, dar o crear un sistema social, político y económico en donde sea viable un proyecto de vida. Y con un proyecto de vida, no, lo que me refiero es a cumplimiento mínimo de garantías fundamentales, derecho al trabajo, para un trabajo decente, ¿no? La oportunidad de que una familia tenga acceso a la alimentación, a la educación de sus hijos, etc. La imposibilidad de realizar esos proyectos de vida te lleva o a la migración forzada o te lleva a estar en un país y en ansiar un cambio de ese status quo que por años no te ha permitido tener un proyecto de vida decente, y tal vez sí apostar a un liderazgo distinto que promete un cambio radical de la estructura política, social y económica del país. Entonces, sí creo que a veces podemos caer en la simplificación del análisis cuando decimos que tal o tal líder está destruyendo la democracia o está afianzándose en el poder con poder popular, sin ver que realmente estos líderes son mucho más consecuencia que causa, y que justamente los liderazgos anteriores no lograron resolver las causas, y por lo tanto el proyecto democrático se volvió algo que los ciudadanos no quisieron defender, ¿no? Y sí, mientras las causas sigan allí y además se profundicen, que es lo que estamos viendo obviamente en un contexto de pandemia, pero que también lo vemos en otros contextos, seguirá en peligro la democracia como tal, porque va a haber siempre terreno fértil para este tipo de liderazgos.
Muchas gracias. Liz, there's a question that maybe you would like to address from Dr. Orlando Perez. And he asks, have you looked at the correlation of B/WM1 that deals with presidential job approval and support and satisfaction with democracy in El Salvador? It's a good question, interesting question that probably brings us closer to an answer about the previous ones. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. And Orlando knows the project very well, which is why he can refer to some of our questions by their code. M1 is our presidential approval variable. So as you might expect in El Salvador, there's a positive correlation between presidential approval and support for democracy. I mean, I guess I said, as you might expect, and I guess there's, in theory, you might think, well, how is that possible, right? But what we are asking is, in the abstract, whether or not people support democracy and people understand the system more or less as a democracy. We actually have a question on the survey where we ask people if they think their country is a democracy. So there's variation in responses to that across the region, but to a large extent, people see elections and they hear their country being talked about as a democracy, so they understand the country is a democracy. They are satisfied with what the system is delivering, and so those who are more satisfied with the president are more satisfied with how democracy is working and more supportive of democracy in the abstract. So, when we find results like that, sometimes it leads people to say, like, well, what does this democracy in the abstract question really tap into then, right? What do we do with that? And I have sort of two answers. One is it's not sufficient for a thorough assessment of public opinion toward democracy. That's why we always want to go down a level and look at other responses to other questions, like the extent to which you would tolerate the removal of checks and balances. So that question that I showed you referring to executive coups or centralization of power in the executive office, it does not use the word democracy. It asks about one way in which the rules might be broken. So that gives us additional insight into public opinion on democracy. And when we develop a thorough assessment of democracy, we want to go beyond the abstract. But I think this question about support for democracy is still an important question in and of itself. And this is my second point, which is that for people who are advocates of democracy, which I hope is everyone here, it matters what the brand reputation of this concept is. So it's sort of an interesting dynamic that support for democracy has increased in El Salvador, and that's tied to approval for the sitting president. But it's not necessarily a bad thing to see that. It's not bad to see that people retain some confidence in the concept of democracy. It just is indeed the fact that you have to peel a layer below that to understand kind of what other mix of attitudes is underneath the surface there. So I hope that answers the question, and maybe also provides a little context on that question.
Thank you very much, Liz. Jose Miguel, I would like you to address our colleague Randy Pestana's question regarding what role does the citizenry prescribe to the military and security forces in Central America? Has this changed over time? This is something that we have not spoken about so far, but it's certainly a relevant question, particularly because of the new role the armed forces have played in different moments, including a coup d'etat in Honduras in 2009, which we thought was something we were not going to see again, but unfortunately happened. Let's hope that will not repeat itself. But role of the armed forces and security forces.
I haven't seen the results about that in the last round of the Americas Barometer, but so far in past rounds, in the past editions of the Americas Barometer, I think the military are almost, not always, but almost always requested to fulfill some functions in public security, right? And that remains, and unfortunately, I would say that remains, that this push to see some sort of mano dura responses and asking the military to fulfill those functions. I don't, as I said, I haven't looked at the results of the last version, but I'm afraid that that those haven't changed that much, at least at this point, right? And I want to say also that this is in part also the result of there is a sort of line or area in public opinion in the political culture in Central America, in which some people at least, I'm sorry about this, but some people have always seen the military as the solution to many problems, right? And that's a part of the political culture also in some population, right? But there is also, and I think it's important to say, that this has been fed, this has been, boosted by political elites also, and I'm not talking here about military. I'm talking about civilians who, at different points, and based on convenience, based on political gain, have used this idea, have played with this part of the political culture to basically cultivate the idea that the military should be back into the public security realm, right? So we see that we have seen that constantly and for cycles, right? We saw it with the mano dura, zero tolerance plans in the early 2000s. We've seen it again with almost every government. At some point when it's in crisis, they bring back this idea of increasing the security and even sending this terrible message to the people that that human rights is a matter of protecting criminals, and the military shouldn't care for that, things like that. Well, this has been cultivated, unfortunately, by some political leaders from time to time. So that makes the military almost all the time being seen as as the possible solution to problems of security.
Gracias. Thank you very much, Jose Miguel. Carolina, there's a question by Josue Sanchez, who's a PhD student here at FIU, talking about the need to explain better to the population. I guess it's civics in many ways, the role of the legislative, that we've been putting a lot of emphasis on the executive, but it seems to be that we have to see how is it the different branches of government work, and are we putting enough emphasis on the importance of representation in parliament? ¿Cómo es que la representación política en el primer poder, que debería de ser la representación más directa del ciudadano, parece, primero, no ser entendida y segundo, no ser apreciada? Es decir, que la ciudadanía está por dejar que se cierre el Congreso y permitir por esa vía una solución autocrática.
It's an excellent question because, and I think it speaks of the history of Latin America with the presidential system. I mean, it is well known that I would say in most countries in Latin America, the figure of the president has always been, a major driving force in politics, right? And therefore, the check and balance principle that should characterize democracy tends to be weak in our region, especially vis-a-vis the power of the president. Now, there is, of course, a difference between a democratic president and a non-democratic president, and what happens with the balance of power in those cases. I agree that because the figure of the president, especially in this authoritarian context, is so overpowering, citizens tend to feel that it is the president or the executive power, the institution in charge of, solving the country's problems and delivering, prosperity, economic development, etc. When the structure of government says another story, there are at least three main powers, and democracy, or having a functioning democracy, implies having a balance between them. So I'm afraid that there is indeed perhaps lack of a political culture that give a real weight to not just the legislative power, but also to the judicial power. We tend to be, as citizens, we tend to feel very distant from the judicial power, when in reality it's justice itself is an institution that is, if it works, that it's open to all citizens, and that it has the power, to solve conflicts among individuals. It's a very basic principle of democracy as well. When you cannot solve a conflict, there is a justice system that should be there to support that. So we have, as citizens, focused a lot on the executive power, and especially when we have this emergence or re-emergence of very populist leaders that portray themselves as saviors or messiahs, or them being the people, not the parliament or other powers, but they represent el pueblo, right? That tends to create even a bigger gap between citizens and the legislative branch and the judicial power. And then I will conclude by saying that that's exactly the purpose of a populist leader, to portray parliament and the judicial systems as part of the previous status quo who failed the people, and who created a corrupt system that didn't work and didn't deliver. So the gap grows, and then, of course, Bukele style, you create a new legislative power that, it was elected in democracy, right? In elections, but and that legislative power basically replaces the judicial power. So it is indeed, it's a great question, because I think in few countries you see a strong defense of citizens when it comes to branches of, of government. I mean, I do in Venezuela, for example, I don't remember when now, but there have been so many attacks on institutions. Once the Supreme Court basically nullified a Congress that was won by the opposition, and that created a wave of protest. So it was very interesting to see, people defending electoral results for a new parliament. But that was in the context of, major attacks on democracy. It wasn't just people defending parliament as such. So I think there is indeed a lot of work to do when it comes to ensuring that citizens understand the importance of the principle of balance of power and the importance of functioning branches of government beyond the power of the executive.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carolina. Liz, this might be of interesting suggestion for you, but also a matter of reflection. It comes from Santiago Padilla. In future rounds of the survey, could there be an effective way to measure the impact of propaganda from the executive and or the rich, quote unquote? I ask because so much of the movement in survey results seems anecdotically related to propaganda efforts.
Can I also interject over there and add a question for Liz? Rather to add a question for Liz, and I know Liz has studied charisma for many years, right? And thinking about what we have been seeing in El Salvador, I don't know if you have had any chance to look at the sources of charisma in the case of El Salvador. Just a curiosity, just to tie this question with the previous one.
Well, since we're getting you more and more work on this question, Liz, may I also ask about the role of the media, and especially on networks, on charisma and the presentation of the super leader? And obviously the case of Bukele comes to mind on that one. Thank you.
Okay, wow, thanks. So a lot of work carved out for me, not only here, but in the future. I think the question about whether or not in the future we could sort of more directly get at people's consumption of certain media is a really interesting one. We have asked in past rounds, in particular the last round of the Americas Barometer, some questions about social media usage. We do ask about the extent to which people pay attention to the news. These things end up being somewhat blunt in terms of tapping into the exact channels that people are exposed to in terms of information in a country, but it is something that's certainly interesting and could be done in future surveys. The question of charisma and El Salvador is interesting, and also ties into maybe ties into a number of strands of the conversation that we've been having. What Miguel's referencing is my work on charisma, which has some antecedents in work by others. So I wasn't the first to make this argument, but the argument that I make is that charisma is a matter of perception, and it is a perception that grows when people find themselves in times of crisis, when they find themselves struggling with a situation, when things have turned down and they're looking for an inspiring leader to save the day. And in those cases, in laboratory studies, experiments that we've run, we see people shift their perceptions of leaders, and we do see these leaders as more charismatic. Now, why does this matter? Well, on the one hand, people just think of charisma as like, hey, it's just great to have some charisma. That's a good thing for a leader. But one reason it matters is that we also find, and I've done some work on this in Venezuela with survey data from the Americas Barometer, looking at people's perceptions of Hugo Chávez's charisma. What we see is that the more people saw him to be charismatic, the less willing they were to see bad times when they emerged under his rule, under his leadership, right? So charisma blinds people to some of the downturns that we sometimes see under certain leaders. So charisma is a pretty powerful tool. It tends to arise in times of crisis, and it tends to then protect the leader. So that's just sort of a reflection on charisma. I think we could connect it to El Salvador. Requires a little bit more careful study than I can do right now on the fly, but I think that certainly there's something there. The last point I'll make on this topic is sort of the consequences for public opinion of these types of leaders. And there's a study that's just coming out in one of our main political science journals, the American Journal of Political Science, by a number of people who are formerly associated with LAPOP, still associated with LAPOP to some extent, who have looked at attitudes among those who support Bolsonaro in Brazil. And what they find is that when Bolsonaro is elected, the extent to which his supporters are willing to tolerate deviations from sort of democratic rules of the game, like tolerating executive coups, that increases. So when you put a leader into power who's popular among a set of individuals, among a broad swath of the population, and that leader embraces authoritarian tendencies, that can then trickle down to the population and serve as an additional boost to those attitudes, which is probably a dynamic that we're also seeing in El Salvador. So I think all these things are connected, this sort of charisma, this follow the leader tendency, and so on, to explain what's happening in El Salvador. And again, I would just caution that what charisma tells us is that the more charismatic the leader is seen to be, the sort of slower the public will be to wake up to some of the downsides of that individual's leadership.
Thank you very much, Liz. Jose Miguel, there's a question close to your academic interests regarding cartels and organized crime. Do you think that this phenomenon is a factor for the weakening of governments, and particularly if it is into the interest of criminal organizations to work within failed or failing or weakening or vulnerable political systems?
Yeah, thank you, Presidente. I do think that the presence of cartels and gangs or criminal groups at the local level may make a difference at the local level, right? What I'm seeing from, and this is based actually in some data that LAPOP did in 2017, is that for many people, especially in the Northern Triangle of Central America, for many people, the ones who rule and who provide security are not the state institutions, but the gangs or other groups. I wrote an article about that recently, and that obviously adds to this distrust in government institutions, right? I also concluded this is a separate one, a project in the summer in which we asked people in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras whether they trusted the police, right? And it seems to me that there are two levels, right? There is a sort of general level in which people say, yes, I trust the police, right? Especially now in places like El Salvador, in which the trust in the police seems to be very high. But then when you ask them, you know, in personal interviews, in focus groups, who they will go to solve their problems, they don't go to the police. They go to the gang leader who controls the area, right? So you have basically this sort of divided notion of, well, the police, yeah, we trust the police when it comes to dealing with the general crime, right, in general. But when it comes to solving some of the things, even some urgent needs of security at the local level, they will tell you, I mean, I won't go to the police, I will go to the gang leader, or I'll go to to the, to the leader of the criminal organization that controls there, because they have more capability to deliver at that point.
Thank you, Jose Miguel. I have two final questions. One I will address to Carolina that has to do with human rights, but human rights considered in a broad sense. In the context of polarization that we've seen in Latin America, and well, I think it's a worldwide characteristic, really in Latin America, and I think that has been well put by you all. This polarization brings into the equation the question of human rights being considered a very fundamental part of a democratic society. This includes inclusion, and includes LGBTQ plus rights. It includes environmental rights, etc., with a group of the population feeling very strongly against those issues. How does that affect the likelihood of democracy being strengthened? Because in normal times, one would expect that respecting human rights in a broad sense would strengthen democracy, but then you see this polarization on human rights weakening it. Isn't that a paradox?
I would not only say it's a paradox, I would say it's an alarming paradox, right? Because what happens with this polarization and with the with the increased of power of the anti-right movements in Latin America, and we see that the anti-rights movement is incredibly strong, supported by a strong economic interest from some evangelical churches, etc., that, as we know, strongly oppose women's sexual and reproductive rights, LGBTIQ plus rights, etc. What we see is that leaders who could perhaps be open, progressive, and could have in a different context been supporters of this cause, prefer to either stay silent or to publicly, oppose or express, any potential change that they would do in favor of these communities if they achieve, political power in any form of leadership. So what we have is, on the one hand, a very strong regional anti-rights movement that keeps growing and that is well financed and well supported, and on the other, political leadership that falls into the trap, I have to say, of that polarization, that prefer to stay quiet or to even oppose, advancing these rights, because that could imply, that could compromise his or her chances of achieving an important political position in whatever country they happen to be. That puts civil society in an incredibly difficult situation, because not only, I think NGOs and social leaders, etc., that support these rights are becoming targets of the anti-right movements and are having, less opportunities to work, but their work is also politicized, and although many of these groups and these human rights activists do not belong to political parties, do not support specific candidates or parties, they are seen as politicized or as polarized by society, putting their legitimacy in question. So I do think it's the setbacks that we have seen in the last few years probably have a lot to do with that. Even political leaders like President López Obrador in Mexico, who comes from a tradition of being progressive in these issues, have remained very silent in Mexico, as we have seen, and it is through the court actually that many of these rights have been advanced, or through local legislatures, because the president is incredibly careful about making statements in favor of sexual and reproductive rights or in favor of marriage equality, which is a major disappointment, for many of these groups that thought that a president like him will make a difference. I think he's a clear example of how not only the anti-rights movement has really, damaged the legitimacy and the work that many civil society activists are doing, but also a lot of, different leaders are falling into the trap that these, toxic or taboo issues are better not to be brought up in the into the agenda. And you, President Solis, probably know much better about this than we do, because the situation in Costa Rica, during the last elections was a clear example of how these issues, when they're very polarized, can truly affect political preferences and the way the political debate is conducted. And I think it's a very important conversation to have, but we do need to be very clear. There is no democracy without protection of human rights. These two things are completely intertwined, and having a democracy that excludes communities or individuals because of their sexual orientation or because their support for sexual rights is not a complete democracy. It's a democracy that is excluding entire communities of a society. So we do have a lot of work to do, but I think it's really important to ensure that when we speak about democracy, we speak about a political system that has to guarantee human rights for all and not for only certain sectors of the population.
Thank you very much, Carolina. And finally, Liz, to you from Jean Rosenberg, another colleague here at FIU. Did reaching interviewees by telephone possibly influence the results compared to previous years that used in-person interviews? A sample effect, he says?
So this is an important question, one that we grappled with for the entirety of 2020, when we realized in early 2020 that we were going to need to change the mode of the survey from face-to-face, which is the gold standard and ideal way to carry out a nationally representative survey in the region, to a phone-based approach. So a couple of things that we did. First, we took stock of phone coverage across the region, and it turns out that mobile phone coverage is quite widespread. That's a good thing for phone surveys. It means that we have the ability to reach a large proportion of the population. The coverage specifically is sort of averages around 85 to 90% across the countries. So then what we do is we conduct the survey by way of a random digit dial, so that we are selecting people into the sample at random, drawing mixing out the population and drawing out that representative group. But that group ends up being skewed a bit in general in terms of being higher on socioeconomic status variables like wealth and education. So what we do with the data as we process it is we have weighted the data to benchmarks from the national population, to known benchmarks. And there are a number of different ways that you can do that. But the way that we've done it is we've weighted the data to benchmarks from the prior round of the AmericasBarometer. So for each country, we know from the prior round of the AmericasBarometer what we estimate wealth levels to be, education levels to be, and so on. And then we calibrate the 2021 data by weighting it to those benchmarks. What that does is gives us confidence in cross-time comparisons, because then we know that we're comparing samples that have been balanced to be apples to apples rather than apples to oranges.
Thank you very much, Liz. And with this, we come to an end of this very interesting seminar, The Fading Pulse of Democracy in Central America, based on the results of the LAPOP Lab's AmericasBarometers. I would like to thank our distinguished panelists, Carolina Jiménez, Liz Zechmeister, Jose Miguel Cruz, for their participation, and also all of you who have followed us through Zoom, and ask you please to look into the full report, which brings in very interesting conclusions, not only about Central America, but the rest of the hemisphere. I'm Luis Guillermo Solis, the interim director of the Kimberly-Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at FIU. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. Goodbye and be well.